Operation GCD with an Appalachian grin. Adventures and shenanigans, we're diving right in. Out in the holler where the secrets creep, garbage can dudes digging mighty deep. Secret societies, shadows in the pines. Operation GCD of American rebels design. Double J searching deep in his brain hole, past layers of melted hops and bone resin. From cults to cover-ups, we're talking about all of that. So watch your sixth friend and the truth we trust. The world's a puzzle, grunge rock ain't what it seems. Ancient alien cargo cults haunt the moon's pale beams. Cincinnati schemers, history's a haze. Double J's on the mic, lighting things ablaze. Operation GCD with an Appalachian grin. Adventures and shenanigans, we're diving right in. Join us on the journey and enjoy the show. Thanks for joining us to get a little GC. Yeah, the world's a puzzle, grunge rock ain't what it seems. Ancient alien cargo coats haunt the moon's pale beam. Cincinnati schemers, history's a haze. Double J's on the mic, lighting things ablaze. Hell, the world's a puzzle, grunge rock ain't what it seems. Ancient alien cargo cults haunt the moon's pale beams. Cincinnati schemers, history's a haze. Double J's on the mic, lighting things ablaze. Double J's on the mic, lighting things ablaze.
Boom! Howdy, folks. Your host, Double J, back here coming at you live from my studio / RV dining room located directly inside America. Welcome back, folks of the interwebs. Once again, your host of Operation GCD here, JJ Vance, and perhaps more notably, not the vice president. So anyhow, I will be your pilot and navigator here tonight, folks, for this shenanigan infused journey into the mind of this particular garbage can dude. And not gonna lie to you, folks, got a real barn burner on deck here tonight. The case of Edward Wayne Edwards, the serial killer that you probably have never heard of. And that's the Muppetized version of him right there. This man, in my opinion, was the most diabolical serial killer in American history, and one that almost no one talks about. So we're definitely gonna be talking about that here, folks, tonight. And the man is no longer with us, thank God. He did pass away while awaiting execution in the state of Ohio for a murder back in 2011. He was scheduled for execution later that year. So the I guess that's a positive note, but really the only man who's done the seminal investigation, the most important and really the only study into this serial killer's life is that serial killer Edward Wayne Edwards. That is a fellow by the name of John Cameron, retired Great Falls police detective from Great Falls, Montana. And if folks tuned in to Operation GCD Sundaze last week, you were introduced to the legends of Nathaniel Bar Jonah, the kid-diddling, cannibalistic, homicidal, psychopathic serial killer, whom I came face-to-face with in 2001 in the Cascade County Jail, about 18 inches apart through a thin layer of plexiglass. I saw pure evil. It was this detective, though, John Cameron, the one who wrote this seminal study here on Edward Wayne Edwards, that is, in his retirement after he retired from Great Falls in 2005, Great Falls PD. It was John Cameron that brought Nathaniel Bar-Jonah into justice. And we covered a little bit of that last week, folks, of the interwebs. And just want to remind folks that, while these sound like disparate tales oftentimes here at Operation GCD, there is a narrative being woven through all these things. You can see it obviously here tonight in the aspect of this is the same detective, who I just happened to encounter, the serial killer guy, the cannibalistic, kid-diddling, homicidal, psychopathic serial killer, Nathaniel Bar-Jonah. So, these are the elements of my life that I call high weirdness that I would later be interested in, such matters of this book that this guy wrote anyhow, and the serial killer that he studied. And we'll introduce folks of the interwebs here to a brief journey on tonight's tale, and the tale of Edward Wayne Edwards, first and foremost, how John Cameron came about to intersecting in his life with Edward Wayne Edwards, and of course the implications. So John Cameron, obviously, in his book, I think he's written 2 books now on Edward Wayne Edwards. He obviously asserts a large volume of very high profile murders that Edwards was responsible for. And I'm not saying he's wrong. I'm not sitting here high and mighty without all the evidence that he has to say, well, he's way off target. I do think he's on target. And I also think that Edwards is very much a part of an occult ritualistic assassin network, almost like Maury Terry would imply that Manson too was in his Ultimate Evil, this hardcore kind of hitman dude that comes in these cult crimes, right? Or kind of like how Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole were allegedly part of this nationwide team of occult assassins named the Hand of Death. Well, our tonight's subject, Edward Wayne Edwards, intersects with both of those conversations, because not only did he know Charles Manson, they met in 1952 on a mound in Chillicothe, Ohio, at a reformatory. Not only that, John Cameron well documented Edward Wayne Edwards' occult interests, right? And that how he was a very powerful figure in some sort of occult network, right? And one of those occult, almost without fail, I think it's almost said, even asserted by Cameron, that Edwards' crimes were those of a ritualistic nature. Well, he obviously also profited from these crimes in various capacities, being it Edwards would sometimes, again, this is all stuff John Cameron's well documented in his book, but Edwards would, he would profit in various capacities. Sometimes he would inform on his own crimes to police. Sometimes he would testify for law enforcement in those trials against folks that he had framed for murder. This was part of his MO, and it's well documented. So, it is a lot to take in, but it's also a lot to consider that this dude intersects with these individuals we already suspect to be associated with these kind of network of things. And, I think Cameron builds a strong argument. Again, I don't know if he's completely right, but he's certainly in the right conversation, right? So one of those ritualistic occult crimes that Cameron attributes to Edward Wayne Edwards, and rightfully so, in my opinion, because he's at least involved in the situation, because the Zodiac Killer, I know this was a Paramount Plus show a number of years ago with John Cameron, but the Paramount Plus, it was me, I believe it was what the name of the program was. Well, maybe not. Anyhow, so while I'm looking this up, this was obviously a major factor in that miniseries, and it was that John Cameron traveling around to some of these different places and cities, and kind of going over these crimes that he wrote in his book that Edwards was associated with, and he traveled around with Edward Wayne Edwards' own biological son from his first marriage, and we'll get into those, unpacking the ins and outs of those details, because it was actually Edward Wayne Edwards' daughter from his second marriage that would actually end up turning him in. So we know for a fact this was the miniseries. So this, before I go into the known knowns of what we know about Edward Wayne Edwards and whom he killed and what we know about those and what we can kind of decipher from it. This was one of the key things I thought was a salient characteristic we'll go over tonight. But relative to the Zodiac murders, the individual in the hood at Lake Berryessa in September of 1969, almost, the Zodiac stuff goes hand in hand in San Francisco is going on at the same time the Manson stuff's going on. So all I'm saying is, it's interesting. Those two definitely knew each other by that point. In fact, Edwards would write about it in his book, but I'll get to that in a second. And the Zodiac Killer at Lake Berryessa was wearing that hood, stabbed Cecilia Shepard and Brian Hartnell. And Brian Hartnell would survive and provide a detailed account of the conversations he had with the killer that day in the hood. That hood's always struck me as some sort of magical hood. I'm not saying it's specifically a thelemic magical hood, but Edward Wayne Edwards has been documented by John Cameron in his investigation and in his book to have been a practitioner and follower of Thelema, of Aleister Crowley. So when I see a hood like this, and I'm like, all right, well, that does look kind of, looks kind of. This was the movie, the David Fincher movie depiction of it, right? But it looks slightly, I think it looks. Here's another artist rendition, right? And just so happens the guy that was in that hood, right? The guy that was, providing these details, the murderer that day. I'm sorry, disregard. So this is Aleister Crowley in a hood, and it's not the same exact hood, right? And it's not the same exact kind of setup, but you will see it's not the same circle square, but I mean, you do see a cross with a circle on this getup. I won't pretend to know the precise meanings of these things, but I'm happy to look into them further. But I'm just saying it right now. I'm building these foundations around some of the known knowns about what Detective Cameron has identified about Edwards. You see a lot of this. So if Edwards is a practitioner of these kind of occultism and whatnot, and then again, the hood situation, and there's other evidence that in the Zodiac letters, I would argue that this whole I'll do my thing, and there's no doubt I will do my thing. He's always talking about doing his thing. To me, that seems strikingly similar to Crowley's "do as thou wilt," but like a late 1960s version, if you will. But back to the guy in the hood at Lake Berryessa, right? This guy would describe details of Edward Wayne Edwards' life to Brian Hartnell. This is September of 1969. The details that this man describes all occurred to Edward Wayne Edwards, the guy in the hood, that is. All were events from Edward Wayne Edwards' life. They just occurred 10 years prior, 1959. So the guy in the hood says he's escaped from a Deer Lodge prison in Montana, killed a guard, stole a car, and is heading to Mexico, right? I believe those were the precise details. And Edward Wayne Edwards did do all that stuff in 1959, which is what landed him. Well, they didn't document him as killing the guard, but a guard was killed in the Deer Lodge prison riot in 1959 that the National Guard had to come shut down. And that is where he escaped from as well in that riot. So whether or not he killed the guard, I suppose that could be up for debate, but he knew the guard was dead and he may have been involved in that because there was only a team of, I believe, 25 inmates that were really part of this core group. But we'll go into that more here tonight. All I'm saying here, folks, is when Cameron presents these arguments of these larger scale, crimes, it's there might be something to be said there, and when he later connects them to Adam Walsh and the Atlanta child killings, there's maybe some stuff to be said there, especially if you're considering that Adam Walsh's murder was pinned on Otis Toole, and Otis Toole was an associate there of Henry Lee Lucas and alleged to be part of that, again, hand to death situation. And again, it's not the only time that Edwards intersects with these fellows. And we'll go over that some more. But relative to this whole matter of the Adam Walsh thing, well, Toole's down there and he's associated with it, and Edwards is apparently down there, and that's documented. And he may in fact have been associated with it, right? Well, it begs the question: what's Jeffrey Dahmer doing down there? Jeffrey Dahmer is living down there as well at the very same time, was a suspect in there, even by his own father, of the Adam Walsh situation. And strangely enough, meets a lot of the witness descriptions of an individual who was seen with Adam Walsh at that mall that day, Dahmer, that is. And but I'm saying those things that we'll dig into some more of that here tonight, folks. But it seems if we're going to argue some of those things around Toole, and you have this intersection with Edwards, I think there's a lot to be said there. And like I said, tonight's series kind of builds off of, or tonight's tale builds off of last week's, but I agree, it's super sus, very sus. But also, obviously, we're not going to get into all the case of Edward Wayne Edwards tonight. Going to be going over some of those more high profile stuff. And like I said, furthering the work of John Cameron, whom I've been in contact with to come on Operation GCD in the future to discuss these matters. He has not given, Detective John Cameron, retired there, has not given an interview in over 6 years. We have been in contact. I have a bit of optimism regarding the matter because since we first started contacting each other a few months ago, or first started contacting him, we first started emailing a few months ago. In between last week and a few months ago when we started, I believe it was around March, his website was down, Cold Case Cameron, where he documents all of these things in his research with photographs and documents and details and chronologies. That website came back up last week. So it was even down from the Wayback Machine 2 weeks ago. So I'm glad we got some more of that stuff back up to review here tonight, folks. So we'll be going into some of that, and the other thing we're going to go over besides the known murders. We know that Edward Wayne Edwards murdered a Lover's Lane couple in 1977, his own admission, and he knew details to the crime. This was after he got picked up and charged with a 1980 Lover's Lane murder, also in the state of Wisconsin. Both of those were Wisconsin. The only reason this dude's so diabolical, the only reason that we even know anything about this guy, and he, to date, even though he died, almost 15 or 14 years ago now, it's 14 years ago last week, I think. His DNA's never hit for a cold case match anywhere else, right? However, in 2009, his daughter from his second marriage, not the grandson of Edwards from the Paramount show, these would be half siblings. The daughter from his second marriage watched a show in 2009 about a unsolved homicide in Wisconsin. She recalled her father taking her to that site and then leaving days afterwards. She called the police, let them know these details. They went and got her DNA to match, to do they got her to submit her DNA to test it against semen that was left on the victim's gene, the female victim's gene, right? And this is, again, he's part of Edward's MO is putting other people's hair, blood, etc. at scenes in which to frame them. And again, Cameron did a great job of documenting these things, right? So we do know that he's done some of these things. For example, if we take the known knowns of these murders that we know he committed to and were, charged with and convicted of, and we compare those to the ones like he testified in cases against, et cetera, then I think is how we can extrapolate that he's clearly been doing this for a lot longer, right? But more on that, later, obviously. But his daughter submits the DNA tests, test positive for the semen on the genes. Again, this is a man who doesn't make a lot of mistakes, and I imagine the ones he did make were oftentimes covered up by folks that he may have had support from, because this man traveled America. His whole career was just to murder people, it seems. He traveled America even after he got out of prison, after his most wanted times, etc., and did this whole tour of America as a metamorphosized criminal. He wrote a book, went on thousands of TV stations, radio stations, went on 2 different game shows in the 70s. We'll watch some of that here tonight as well to see how diabolical this dude is. One of those shows was called To Tell the Truth. And, he was doing a great job at deceiving folks. You can see kind of how deceptive the man is. That was 1972. But he would go on to travel throughout the whole 70s on this tour of this book tour and stuff, a book he self-published. A book that seemingly he published only to have an excuse to travel around America and murder more folks. One such example may, in fact, be, and we'll be discussing this a little bit tonight as a foundational thing, and then more in the future, these murders, these unsolved, quote unquote, serial killer style murders that seemingly followed the wake of Edward Wayne Edwards' 1970s tour of America on this book tour he did with radio stations and TV stations. Places like Cincinnati, Ohio, the infamous Cincinnati Strangler case, seems to coincide with incidents, and where it's known that at least in some of those incidents that Edwards was in the area. So, and it is that really got the whole journey started as far as knowing where Edwards was in the area and how John Cameron got looped into all this stuff here tonight. But when Edward Wayne Edwards' daughter turned him in 2009, police went and visited him in Louisville, Kentucky. He had just moved there, I believe, from Arizona. This dude gets around a lot. Cameron's got him, renting chartered planes. This is all the way up into the 2000s. That's what I'm saying. Like, Cameron, by his own admission, has been in, interviews he done 7-8 years ago. Because again, the guy, for some reason, is skittish about the subject these days. And I don't fault him. I'm sure he's been harassed about this because no one wants to talk about Edward Wayne Edwards, and no one wants the secrets of Edward Wayne Edwards out. When I say nobody, this guy informed for law enforcement for decades. Again, testified in crime, set other people up. The liability associated with that is astronomical. It's kind of hard to even, try to wrap your brain hole around. But on top of that, he was on federal parole for a lot of this from 1967 until 1977. So if he was, in fact, the Zodiac Killer, Lake Berryessa in September of 69, well, his federal parole officer might have had, some liability there too. Or maybe, just maybe, he's gotten some help. Again, like I said, he knew Charles Manson. They're involved in the same occult occult activities, right? These thelemic offshoot organizations, be it, I don't know if Edward Wayne Edwards was part of the process. I have no idea, but he certainly, like I said, the process is in Atlanta associated with that whole Atlanta child killings. And Cameron's got Edward Wayne Edwards down there in a Marietta Sergeant's police uniform infiltrating the task force. And he's got photographs to support these things and a police report, because Edwards would try to burn that police officer uniform evidence in 1983, and it did not succeed. They found the Marietta Sergeant police uniform in his burnt out home in Pennsylvania, and he went to jail for arson. So we'll be getting into more of that, obviously. But my point being here is, the guy is perhaps the most prolific and diabolical serial killer in American history. And, and he's got a lot of liabilities attached to that too. But in regards to him and Manson comparisons, or, even a Manson 2 style comparison, like I said before, obviously at some point in time, the case of Edward Wayne Edwards appears to me that it will intersect with Operation GCD Thursdays and matters relative to the anatomy of a satanic panic. So definitely folks should tune in for those as well. But, I intend to unpack the criminal cases, the criminal matters in future episodes here on Sundays in the case of Edward Wayne Edwards. But when you do occult stuff like Charlie, you knew Charlie, and you may have been photographed with some Manson members at a Zodiac conference in 2003. Well, John Cameron's got those documentation as well. Well, there may be a lot more to this tale, right? There may be a lot more to this tale. And as far as processing stuff, it's hard to believe that he's infiltrating the child task force in around this child killing situation in Atlanta. And, that's what I'm getting at as far as the Manson 2 situation. And Bill Mincer, Cocaine Bob's co-conspirator, along with the Medellin cartel's #1 person in America back in 1983, and the murder of Roy Radin, the processing son of Sam cult leader guy from New York City, as told in Maury Terry's Ultimate Evil. Well, it seems like this is the same old tune with these kind of characters. I'm not saying I have great evidence of that Edward Wayne Edwards falls in precisely that department, but it certainly appears that way. And as I unpack more of these cases in the future, I'm sure we'll have some more intersections with those matters relative to the anatomy of a satanic panic, right? And I'm telling you, this is a dark tale with Edward Wayne Edwards, but he gets busted for that test positive for that DNA on the semen on the genes of that female in 1980 in the Lover's Lane murder. Again, another Zodiac correlation. We'll get into a little bit more here on some of the statements being made, because Edward Wayne Edwards puts a hint to this in his book, that metamorphosis of a criminal, and he also seems to match the Zodiac profile in this respect. The Zodiac letters, the Zodiac Killer asserted that he would get his rocks off by killing people, right? Well, it seems like Edward Wayne Edwards got his rocks off, literally, in this instance of strangling this woman in a Lover's Lane in 1980. And in 2009, when his daughter saw it on TV, she said, "Oh, wait, my dad took me there," and we left town immediately thereafter. And sure as shit, Edward Wayne Edwards worked at the reception hall, the wedding reception of that young couple that they disappeared from that night. So I'm sure police were probably on him at the time. Who knows if they were deterred otherwise, but nonetheless, when they caught up with him in 2010 and he gave up his DNA, He did some interesting things after that. Seemingly the day after, John Cameron's tracked the day after. Cameron gave his DNA in 2009. A number of posts were made on various forums on true crime communities on the interwebs where seemingly somebody was divulging a lot of details that only the killer would know. So that's very interesting. Again, John Cameron has been discounted for the wide-ranging nature in which he's described these things, but I think many folks here tonight can understand that may in fact be a larger network here. A larger network that I'm describing, like how Edward Wayne Edwards would get Social Security cards and driver's licenses in 1956 under the name James Garfield Langley, right? He's busted in Oregon. This is what sends him to prison in that Deer Lodge prison, right? That he escapes from a few years later and then becomes the most wanted person. But how does he get these documents, right? Again, this is that book he wrote, Metamorphosis of a Killer. And John Cameron asserts that this is this book here, and it's available for free on download from his homepage. John Cameron, that is. This book here, written by Edward Wayne Edwards in 1972, that he toured America on, was a roadmap to his previous murders and a springboard to his future murders, as he would allegedly kill many, many more folks. So we know he killed a Lover's Lane in 1977 because he admitted to that after getting busted for the 1981. So turns in his DNA. They get him for the 1980 Lover's Lane murder in Wisconsin. He wants the death penalty. He's been caught. He wants the death penalty. They tell him Lover's Lane murder in Wisconsin in 1977. He knows details of that crime. He gets convicted of that case. The only the killer would know. Also doesn't qualify for the death penalty, right? Also doesn't qualify. And so then he admits to another murder, right? He admits to adopting a man, a 19-year-old man in Ohio in 1990, I think 5. Forcing him, coaxing him into joining the army, goes to boot camp, comes home, tells him to go AWOL. While on AWOL, Edwards murders him. And, collects the $250,000 life insurance policy on him. This is 1997, I believe, when he finally gets that money. And this is how he's funding his life of crime, is through robberies, frauds, et cetera, et cetera. And doing so very, 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 again, I'm sure he had a little bit of top cover at times because, again, he'd go to places, in fact, that jurisdiction in Ohio where he ends up getting, dying from that, being in prison in Ohio for that 96 murder, even though he was living in Louisville by the time they got up to him. That 96 murder finally got him the death penalty. So he got extradited to Ohio and, they were pending execution. But, it's one of the detectives up there. He wasn't happy about a lot of this stuff. So there's a lot of detectives, I imagine, like that guy in northern Ohio, northeast Ohio, that wasn't happy to find out this dude had been living there, and they had a lot of unsolved murders. I believe that dude attributes 15 to him, that one detective, and that's not John Cameron. So again, there's a lot of other folks that have taken some looks at these things from individual departments within their jurisdiction. And they've reached the same conclusion that not only is Edward Wayne Edwards the fucking devil, but he's probably, in the metaphorical sense, more like the Grim Reaper, I guess, right? He's probably murdered a lot more folks. Cameron estimates it at hundreds. Cameron estimates that Edward Wayne Edwards committed his first murder at the age of 5 when his mother died of suspicious death from I believe it was a rifle or a shotgun shot to her stomach. So either she pulled the trigger on that rifle or shotgun, pointing it at her stomach, or her young 5-year-old son did, because he was born as a bastard. He didn't know his father. His mother, one night stand situation. She goes to prison. He grows up with his aunt and uncle, thinking those are his parents. His mother gets out of prison, and then she's dead shortly thereafter. So then he bounces around a number of reformatories and whatnot, ultimately basically escaping at the age of 13 on his own. Fakes some birth certificate, joins the Marines at age 16. So this dude's very prolific and has apparently just been nonstop ever since, right? Until they finally caught him. In 2009, he pretended to be a feeble old man on oxygen and using a cane to walk, but even the prison guards in Ohio would report that they would wheel him around the prison. And we'll watch some videos of that here tonight. Some of the interviews he gave there, and see how diabolical, just see how calmly he explains how he murders this Danny Boy Edwards guy. And again, Cameron presents an incident or presents a theory how Edward, much like everything else, he got this, how devious this guy was. He adopts this 19-year-old, has the 19-year-old change his name to Danny Boy Edwards, right? That wasn't his legal name by any means. Kills him, et cetera, et cetera. But what he was doing, again, is Edwards would frame folks for other crimes. Cameron claims that Edwards was going to would have planned to use Danny Boy Edwards' DNA or something else to plant at the scene of a different crime. And he suspects, Cameron argues, that in fact did happen. And we'll go over that tonight too. However, those connections were never made, but that's not to say that that wasn't the evidence found at the scene. You know what I mean? There's a lot of folks that don't want to talk about this. On top of this seemingly cult network of ritualistic assassins, you know, Manson 2 style or whatnot, right? Or Hand of Death style, right? Again, folks that Edwards intersects with in life, right? Doing similar things that they do, cult ritualistic wise, seemingly, right? Again, John Cameron documented this through other folks in prisons and whatnot, but Cameron found his way in, or Edwards found his way into Cameron's life the same way I was saying that other detective was butthurt about the circumstances presented to him and the diabolical nature that he immediately saw. This killer was living in their jurisdiction. They have a lot of unsolved murders that this dude, again, would work his way into folks' lives, set up frame jobs. You know, he would do, seemingly from Cameron's study, do multiple throughout the year. This is his main focus. This guy's chartering planes. He's hiring attorneys, setting up fake businesses. Hart Publishing Company that published that book that he toured America on in the 70s didn't exist. It existed on paper. It was a front company that he printed that book himself and hired attorneys to promote it and marketing, et cetera, et cetera. So this dude's dark. But what we do know is that he didn't, you know, he had a very rough upbringing, and reports from that upbringing said he was a sadomasochistic psychopath, I believe at the age of 16. Was documented this with a IQ of 132. So we're talking about somebody who's very intelligent as well. So that should never be ignored. But it is the epicenter of how it got to John Cameron's life before he even had any notions that this guy existed, Edward Wynne Edwards, or that he was, you know, some prolific serial killer that had been deceiving folks and manipulating folks for decades and murdering folks, lots of folks. Homeland Security. And this is interesting too. Homeland Security. We'll be wrapping this free Patreon preview outline and summary of tonight's tale of the case of Edward Wynne Edwards with this point right here, folks. John Cameron was much like the other detective. He's working for the prison board after retirement from Great Falls. After he brought to justice Nathaniel Barjona, who, again, if we're considering networks, like I mentioned last week in Sundaze, that Bridgewater State Mental Hospital, the same Bridgewater State Mental Hospital that allegedly my old stalker, who insisted on being my public relations representative, despite me never having the job, there's no vacancy for that employment, was not seeking public relations representative. Buffalo Jared Revisa, the guy that I felt wanted to murder me and wear my skin as a human coat, and then will later go on what seems to be a transpocalypse mind control assassin multi-state stabbing spree. The murder victim, 6 attempted murder, 1 murder. The murder victim hired him as his PR rep, just saying. That man sits allegedly today in Bridgewater State Hospital, the same state hospital that ignored numerous statements by Nathaniel Barjona that he wanted to kidnap, torture, murder, and eat children. They ignored the judge when he said that too, told the judge that, and the judge is like, nah, you're good, dude. We're going to send you back out in society. Barjona then told another psychiatrist the same thing. He was going to kidnap, torture, murder, eat children. They said, nah, you're good, bud. Same Bridgewater State Mental Hospital, and that same judge that let him out, where 4 weeks later, Nathaniel Barjona there in Massachusetts in 1991 would kidnap and attempted torture, murder, rape another young boy. Caught in the process once again and given probation once again. Again, this is his 5th occurrence of the same activity over a 25-year span. He just got out of the loony bin on a 14-year stint of a 20-year crime, 20-year conviction for the same activity, that the sadistic rape, torture, and attempted murder of 2 young boys, kidnapping. So that judge that let him out, though, Barjona, back in 91, that's the same judge that let Ted Kennedy walk on the Chappaquiddick incident, which the victim was RFK's staffer from his 68 presidential election. A lot of process stuff there around that murder of RFK, and a lot of process stuff around Ted Kennedy. Perhaps a comment for a different day, but that is the special prosecutor from Martha's Vineyard, that same judge years earlier. So sometimes I wonder, as these things evolve over many decades, and this network seemingly allows these psychopaths back into society. I wonder if it's the same. It seems like the same network when we can kind of draw these correlations decades apart. Letting Teddy Kennedy walk. He's already associated with the process at that time. The process is associated with RFK's assassination, including Sirhan Sirhan documented at process sex parties by law enforcement investigatory reports. Sex parties at the Tate Polanski house, nonetheless. And other reports inferring a lot more there. But I don't want to get too far off topic other than saying that when I see a judge connected to something like that, letting Ted Kennedy walk, when a witness when he drives a car off a bridge allegedly in Martha's Vineyard, and the witness, the victim that he left to die in his car, he went home to go to sleep before he reported it for another 12 hours or so. That judge let him walk with just suspending his license, his driver's license. He was a special prosecutor at the time, but I'm just saying, process folks are going to process. So I wonder, really, after looking at, some of these same characters involved over time with some of the same kind of activities, letting folks walk, letting these monsters, terrorize our society. It's, begs the question, larger elements of, some Operation kind of Gladio type activities, but perhaps a story for a different day. As we're here to talk Edward Wayne Edwards. And when John Cameron, that detective, got that Homeland Security notice to check crimes. Why Homeland Security? I don't know, because it's interesting. Because the FBI didn't want anyone asking questions. So John Cameron's at Deer Lodge Prison, that same prison that Edward Wayne Edwards escaped from, the same prison that Nathaniel Barjona died at. But this is 2 years after his death there in 2008. John Cameron gets that memorandum from Homeland Security saying, check your jurisdictions during these times, these places, and check for any Lover's Lane murders. Well, you know what? Edward Wayne Edwards committed a robbery in Great Falls, Montana in 1956, John Cameron's hometown. The town, again, where I met Nathaniel Barjona, the kid-diddling, cannibalistic, homicidal, psychopathic serial killer that may or may not have fed me a human meat burger at Hardee's on Central Avenue back in 2000 there in Great Falls. And sure shit, there was a Lover's Lane unsolved homicide coinciding at the same dates that Edward Wayne Edwards was in Great Falls in 1956 and coinciding with the same dates of that robbery. So that is how John Cameron got his way in there tonight. And we will be exploring all these topics here, folks, of the interwebs. So I appreciate y'all joining me here tonight to get a little GCD. In the case of Edward Wayne Edwards, the serial killer y'all probably never heard about. So tune in this Wednesday. Let me see if I got a couple plugs here real quick before we head on over to the Patreon side of tonight's tale. But I got this Wednesday, I got the Occult and or esoteric review of the 1995 cinematic masterpiece, So I Married an Axe Murderer. So I got that coming up here. Well, that'll be a good one. And then we got Thursdays, unpacking more of the anatomy of the satanic panic, which again, circumstances like we're discussing tonight. Well, I'm only going to be focusing here on the case of Edward Wayne Edwards, and future shows here on Sundays be focusing on the criminal aspects of it. But as I've clearly pointed out and try to emphasize a little bit here as well, that he's clearly going to be intersecting at some point in time, I believe, in that other series. And on that note, folks of the interwebs, thanks for joining me here again to get a little GCD. I hope y'all catch this broadcast in the future. Come visit us over on Patreon for the rest of tonight's tale. And if you're joining us here right now, and come on over and we'll unpack more of this diabolical serial killer. One I would argue is the most heinous and diabolical serial killer in American history, and the one you probably never heard of. So on that note, folks of the interwebs, catch you next time.
Operation GCD with an Appalachian grin. Adventures and shenanigans, we're diving right in. Out in the holler where the secrets creep, garbage can dudes digging mighty deep. Secret societies, shadows in the pines. Operation GCD of American rebels design. Double J searching deep in his brain hole, past layers of melted hops and bone resin. From cults to cover-ups, we're talking about all of that. So watch your sixth friend and the truth we trust. The world's a puzzle, grunge rock ain't what it seems. Ancient alien cargo cults things ablaze. OpGCD with an Appalachian grin, adventures and shenanigans, we're diving right in. Join us on the journey and enjoy the show. Thanks for joining us to get a little GC. Hey, world's a puzzle, brunch rock ain't what it seems. Ancient alien cargo coats haunt the moon's pale beam. Cincinnati schemers, history's a haze. Double J's on the mic, lighting things ablaze. Hell, the world's a puzzle, grunge rock ain't what it seems. Ancient alien cargo cults haunt the moon's pale beams. Cincinnati schemers, history's a haze. Double J's on the mic, lighting things ablaze. Double J's on the mic, lighting things ablaze.